The kitchen clock read 2:14 in the morning, and Margaret Holloway had not slept in 11 days. She sat at the same oak table where she had eaten breakfast every morning for 37 years, but nothing about the room felt familiar anymore. The overhead light cast everything in a flat, institutional yellow. Outside, the first hard freeze of an Illinois October pressed against the windows, and the neighborhood was completely silent, the way neighborhoods only go silent when the world has agreed without anyone saying so that something irreversible has happened. Arthur's chair sat across from her empty. Margaret did not look at it directly. She had learned in these 11 days since his heart stopped in the driveway with a snow shovel still in his hand that looking at empty chairs was not grief. It was punishment, and she had punished herself enough for one lifetime without adding new methods. What she was doing instead was working. Spread across the table were 3 months of bank statements, a stack of utility bills, two folders of household receipts, and the single thin envelope that Richard Calloway's paralegal had dropped off 2 days ago with a note that said only the reading is Thursday at 10. Margaret had spent her entire adult life managing a household on the budget Arthur handed her each month, a fixed amount deposited into a joint checking account that she was expected not to exceed. She had never been given access to his business accounts, his investment statements, or anything related to the independent auditing firm he had operated out of a rented office on Michigan Avenue for the past 22 years. Arthur had called this arrangement practical. He was the one who understood finance. She was the one who understood everything else. It had seemed reasonable for 4 decades. It no longer seemed reasonable. She had started with the household checking account, the one she actually knew, and worked her way outward through whatever paper trails she could find in the filing cabinet Arthur kept in the hallway closet. What she found was mostly ordinary: grocery receipts, property tax installments, the quarterly payment to their landscaper. But wedged between two folders near the back of the second drawer, she found something that made her stop. It was a single bank statement, not from their joint checking account, but from an institution she had never heard of, Northeastern Savings and Trust. The account number began with digits she did not recognize. The statement showed no deposits and no withdrawals, only a single line item repeated every month. Like a heartbeat, a service and maintenance fee of $12 debited on the 15th. She looked at the date the account had been opened, January of 2005. 18 years of $12 monthly fees for an account she had never been told existed. She did a calculation on the back of an envelope. $2,592 paid in perfect silence for reasons she could not yet name. She wrote the account number on a separate piece of paper and set it to the side. Then she kept reading. By the time the kitchen clock reached 3:40, she had found nothing else irregular. But that single account number sat at the edge of the table like a splinter she could not stop pressing with her thumb. Arthur had been a meticulous man. He did not pay $12 a month for 18 years by accident. He paid it because the account was worth protecting. And he had protected it so well that his wife of 40 years had never once suspected it was there. Margaret turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a while. She was not crying, she was thinking. There was a difference, and she was grateful she still knew it. She had been a doctoral candidate in English literature at Northwestern University when she met Arthur Holloway at a faculty mixer in the fall of 1979. She was 28, finishing her dissertation on Virginia Woolf, and she had a quiet kind of confidence that came from years of reading closely and thinking carefully. Arthur was 31, handsome in a blunt Midwestern way, and he had an energy she initially mistook for intellectual passion. It took her years to understand that what she had actually mistaken it for was control. He liked to shape things. He liked to be the one who decided how rooms were arranged, how money moved, what the plan was, and when it would be executed. He had convinced her not through argument, but through the slow accumulation of small suggestions that their family needed a full-time mother more than Northwestern needed another English professor. She had set down her dissertation in 1981 and never picked it back up. She had not thought of it as a loss for a very long time. She had trained herself not to. Now, sitting alone in the dark kitchen at 4 a.m, she thought about how Arthur had always managed to make the things she gave up seem like gifts she had chosen to give. She thought about Connor, Her son was 38 years old and worked as a structural engineer in Dallas. He had driven up to Chicago the night Arthur died and had been in the house constantly in the days that followed, hovering in a way that felt less like comfort and more like supervision. On the morning after the death, before any phone calls had been made to the funeral home, before Margaret had even changed out of the clothes she'd been wearing when the paramedics arrived, Connor had pulled her aside in the hallway and asked a single question. Not whether she was all right, not whether she needed anything. He had asked whether Arthur had left anything behind in his private workspace. Margaret had told him she didn't know. She had watched his face process that answer, and she had seen something move behind his eyes that she could not then identify. She could identify it now, sitting in the dark 12 days later with a mysterious account number written on the back of an envelope in her own handwriting. What she had seen in Connor's face was relief. She pushed back from the table, stood up slowly, and made herself a cup of tea she would not drink. Then she went to the hallway closet, took out Arthur's filing cabinet, and started again from the beginning. Thursday arrived the way bad days tend to arrive in Chicago in October, gray and wet and without apology. Margaret dressed carefully as she always did for things that mattered. A tailored black cardigan over a charcoal dress, her silver hair pinned back pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had built a life around dignity and intended to keep it intact regardless of what the next 2 hours produced. Chloe met her in the lobby of Richard Calloway's building on Wacker Drive. At 34, Chloe had her mother's eyes and her father's jawline and a career in hospital administration that she had built entirely on her own after Arthur pulled her out of private school during what he had called the difficult years of 2001. She hugged Margaret tightly in the marble lobby, and Margaret held on for an extra second before letting go. Connor was already in the conference room when they arrived. He was wearing a blazer Margaret had not seen before, and he stood up when they entered with the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed being present in a room. He kissed his mother on the cheek. Margaret accepted it without comment. Richard Calloway entered a moment later, and Margaret watched him the way she had learned to watch people in the first few seconds before they understood they were being watched. He was a man in his mid-60s, silver-haired and polished with the rehearsed warmth of someone who delivered bad news professionally. She had met him twice before at Arthur's firm holiday events, and he had been smooth and easy both times, the kind of man who was never caught off guard because he had prepared the room in advance. Today, something was different. He set his leather portfolio on the table and did not look at her. Not immediately, not the way people do when they were about to say something routine. He looked at his portfolio. He looked at the window. He looked at his own hands as he opened the folder. A man who had been doing this job for 30 years did not avoid eye contact with the widow unless he had been avoiding it since before she walked in the room. Margaret folded her hands on the table and waited. Calloway cleared his throat and began. The legal language was dense, and she had not expected to understand all of it in real time, but she had spent the previous 3 days reading everything she could find about estate law, and she understood enough. The clauses stacked one on top of the other like weights being added to a scale. The primary residence at 412 Elmwood Drive was currently encumbered by 2 secondary mortgages, both in default with outstanding debt exceeding the property's current market value. The joint savings account, the one Margaret had believed held the accumulated savings of a 40-year marriage, had a remaining balance of $411. The life insurance policy, a $500,000 policy Arthur had taken out in 1994, had a beneficiary designation change filed in 2021. The new beneficiary was a corporate entity registered in Delaware called Apex Holdings, LLC. Chloe said something sharp. Margaret did not hear it. She was looking at Calloway, who was still not looking at her. The total liquid assets available to the estate, Calloway said, his voice careful in the way that very specific carefulness only happens when a man has practiced a sentence, amount to approximately $5,000. The room held a silence that had weight and temperature. Margaret let the silence sit for 4 full seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Calloway, when did you first become aware of Apex Holdings?" He looked at her now. He had not expected the question, or perhaps he had expected it, but not phrased quite that way. Not that quickly, not with that particular quietness. "Arthur updated certain provisions in 2020, he said. He met with me to discuss some restructuring. And at that meeting, Margaret said, did it occur to you to notify his wife that he was restructuring the beneficiary designation on a $500,000 life insurance policy? Calloway opened his mouth and closed it. He said something about client confidentiality and the limitations of his role as executor. Margaret listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, I understand, and she did. She understood exactly what had happened in that meeting in 2020, and she understood exactly what Calloway's careful silence had been protecting, and she filed both understandings away in the same place she kept everything that would be useful later. Chloe was furious on her behalf, which Margaret appreciated but did not need. Connor sat very still in his chair, which Margaret noticed more than her daughter's anger. When Calloway finished it and began explaining next steps and timelines and options for the foreclosure process, Connor leaned slightly toward Margaret and spoke quietly. He said he had some contacts through his firm and Dallas attorneys who handled estate complications regularly, and that if Margaret would sign a temporary power of attorney, he could have them begin working on the situation immediately. He said it would be faster and less painful than going through the court system alone. Margaret looked at the wall across from her for a moment. Then she said, you know, your father used to do that. He would prepare something in advance and then explain why it made sense for me to sign it. She picked up her purse. I'll keep that in mind. She walked out of the conference room without signing anything. In the elevator going down, Chloe pressed her hand. Margaret squeezed back once and let go. She needed to think, and she thought best alone. The drive back to Elmwood Drive took 40 minutes in the rain, and Margaret spent most of it doing arithmetic in her head. Not the arithmetic of the estate, which was catastrophic and would require proper legal help to untangle, but a different kind of arithmetic. The arithmetic of years and absences and explanations she had accepted without question. She called Patricia Dunn from the car. Patricia had been her closest friend for 30 years, a former civil litigator who had retired to Evanston and kept a sharper mind than most people half her age. Margaret had met her at a neighborhood association meeting in 1993 and trusted her the way she trusted very few people, not because Patricia was kind, though she was, but because Patricia was accurate. She said what was true even when it was inconvenient, and she did not dress it up. Margaret told her everything. The account Calloway had described, the beneficiary change, the Delaware LLC, the $5,000. She heard Patricia go very quiet on the other end, the particular quiet of someone organizing information rapidly. Apex Holdings registered in Delaware, Patricia said finally. That's not a coincidence, Margaret. Delaware Incorporation is used for one reason above all others, and that's to make it as difficult as possible to trace the actual ownership structure. Arthur didn't set this up last year. This took time. Years, probably. How many years? The 2020 beneficiary change is what they're showing you, but that's just when he updated the paperwork. The infrastructure behind it could be much older. A pause. You said he had a workspace in the basement that he kept locked. He always called it his sanctuary. Men who hide things do not hide them in bank vaults. They hide them where they believe no one will look because looking would be impolite. Another pause, shorter this time. Don't sign anything Connor gives you. Not until you have your own attorney review it. I know. And Margaret. Patricia's voice changed register slightly. The basement. Before you do anything else. Go look at the basement. Margaret told her she would. Then she asked a question that had been sitting in the back of her throat since the elevator ride down from Calloway's office. Patricia, do you think Arthur was the only one who knew about this? Patricia did not answer immediately. What made you ask that? Connor asked me the morning after Arthur died whether Arthur had left anything behind in his workspace. Before the funeral home, before I'd made a single phone call. That was his first question. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Go look at the basement, she said again. Margaret spent the rest of that day doing what she had been doing since Arthur died, moving through the house, with methodical intention, room by room, pulling open every drawer and cabinet and examining what was there. She worked from the top floor down, which meant she reached the basement, last in the early evening when the light outside was already gone, and the house had the specific silence of a place that used to have more people in it. She had been in Arthur's workshop perhaps a dozen times in 40 years, always briefly and always by invitation when he wanted to show her something he was building. The room smelled of sawdust and motor oil and the faint metallic tang of old tools. The pegboard on the wall held Arthur's collection of wrenches and screwdrivers and chisels. Each one hung on a hook with a painted outline behind it showing exactly where it belonged. Everything was labeled. Everything was in its place. The order of it used to comfort her. She had read it as evidence of a careful man. She understood now that it was something else entirely. It was the order of someone who needed to know exactly where everything was at all times, because exactly where everything was at all times was information that could not be shared. She found the heavy oak workbench along the far wall and began clearing it. She threw rust-pitted screwdrivers into a trash bag and dropped dried cans of wood stain into a box for disposal. When she dragged the cast iron vise from one end of the bench to the other, the metal edge caught the wood with a sharp crack, and a section of the thick oak planking buckled and tilted upward. She stopped. She looked at what had happened. The plank had not simply cracked. It had dislodged cleanly along a seam that was invisible when the plank was lying flat. She crouched down and looked at the edge. The wood there was smooth and slightly worn the way wood gets when it has been lifted and replaced many times over many years. She stood up. She went to the pegboard, took down the heaviest hammer she could find, and she wedged a flathead screwdriver under the loose plank and pried upward. The wood groaned. She applied more pressure. The plank came free in a split and a crack, and underneath it was a hollow space roughly the size of a shoebox cut directly into the body of the workbench. Inside the hollow was a fire-rated metal lockbox with a heavy combination padlock. Margaret looked at it for a moment. She did not feel frightened or even particularly surprised. She felt the specific clarity that comes when the last piece of a pattern falls into alignment. She had known without being able to name it since the morning after Arthur died, since Connor's first question in the hallway, that there was something here. Now here it was. She raised the hammer and brought it down on the padlock. The metal rang like a bell in the enclosed basement. She hit it again and again. She thought about the $12 monthly fee for 18 years. She thought about the private school tuition Chloe had lost in 2001 and the kitchen renovation that had been perpetually unaffordable. And every year she had clipped grocery coupons and stayed inside a budget that Arthur set. And she had never questioned because questioning it had always been made to feel unnecessary. She hit the padlock 4 more times. On the 6th blow, the locking mechanism gave and the latch sprang open. She lifted the lid. On top was a tight band of $100 bills, more cash than Margaret had seen in one place in many years. Beneath the cash was a small leather pouch, soft and worn, the kind of pouch that had been handled regularly for a long time. And beneath the pouch was a thick manila envelope sealed with a disc of dark red wax pressed flat and smooth in the center. She opened the leather pouch first. A single key slid into her palm, heavy brass, old-fashioned in shape, with a geometric pattern etched into the bow. It was the kind of key made for a real door on a real building. It was not a key to anything in this house. She set it on the workbench and broke the wax seal on the envelope. The documents inside were dense with legal language, but she had spent enough time reading contracts over the course of her marriage to find her footing in them quickly. It was a deed of trust accompanied by years of property tax receipts and utility statements, all of them neatly clipped and organized in chronological order, the way a meticulous man organizes things he intends to keep private for a very long time. The property address on the deed was 188 Blackwood Lane, Lake George, New York. Margaret had never been to Lake George. She and Arthur had vacationed in Florida when the children were young, and later in various places around the Midwest, and twice to visit Chloe during her college years. Arthur had occasionally gone to conferences in various cities and returned with the mild fatigue of a man who had worked hard and was glad to be home. He had never once mentioned Lake George. She looked at the purchase date on the deed. The property had been bought outright in full with cash in 2002. 2002 was the year after Arthur had come home from work one evening, looking hollowed out, and told her that his auditing firm was on the edge of insolvency, that they would have to pull Chloe out of private school, that the renovation they had been planning for years would need to be postponed indefinitely. Margaret had believed him. She had held him that night while he talked about the stress of it, and she had told him they would get through it, and she had meant it. And then she had gone to Chloe's school the following week and signed the withdrawal paperwork herself because Arthur said he couldn't bear to do it. In the year that he told her they were nearly bankrupt, he bought a house in the Adirondacks with cash. She kept reading. The entity that owned the property was called the Margaret A. Holloway Revocable Trust. She read that line 3 times before she allowed herself to understand it. Then she flipped to the signature page and found her own name written in cursive at the bottom, in handwriting that was close enough to hers that she would have accepted it without scrutiny if she had been handed this document in a different context. But she had not signed this document. The loops in the capital M were too tight. The H leaned slightly forward in a way hers never did. Arthur had watched her sign her name thousands of times over 4 decades, and he had replicated it well enough to pass a notary's review. He had used her name, her identity, her legal standing, and her forged signature to create a structure that did not appear anywhere in the household files she had been permitted to see. At the bottom of the envelope were 3 photographs, the old square kind with a white border, the kind people stopped taking once everything went digital. The first showed a cedar shingled house of considerable size perched above a lake surrounded by pine trees with large windows that would fill the interior with light. The second showed the inside, a vaulted ceiling and a stone fireplace and a staircase made of pale wood. The third showed Arthur. He looked perhaps 10 years younger than the man she had buried. He was standing on a wide deck, tanned and relaxed in the posture of someone who was entirely at ease in the place he was standing. His arm was around the shoulders of a woman with long auburn hair who was leaning into him and holding a glass of wine and smiling at whoever was taking the picture. In the lower right corner of the photograph, slightly out of focus, was a child's stroller. Margaret stood in the basement of her house in the fluorescent light and looked at the stroller for a long time. She did not look at the woman. She did not look at Arthur's smile, which was a smile she recognized as genuine and which she had not seen on his face in Chicago for longer than she could accurately remember. She looked at the stroller, and she thought about the brass key sitting on the workbench beside her, and she thought about 188 Blackwood Lane Lake, George, New York, purchased in cash in 2002, held in a trust that bore her forged name. She picked up her phone and called Chloe. "Cancel the moving truck," she said when Chloe answered. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, smooth and level, as if she had rehearsed it, though she had not. "I'm not coming to stay with you." "Mom, what happened? Did something?" "I'm going to New York," Margaret said. "There's something there I need to see." She picked up the brass key from the workbench and dropped it into her purse. Then she went upstairs to pack a bag. She was pulling a sweater from the closet when her phone rang. It was Chloe calling back, but Margaret let it go to voicemail and reached instead for a second sweater, the heavier one because it would be cold in the mountains. She was folding it into her bag when the phone rang again, and this time it was a number she did not recognize with an Albany area code, which made no sense, and she stared at it until it stopped. Then a text arrived from Chloe. It said, "Mom, please call me. Connor just phoned me. He wanted to know if you found anything in Dad's workshop." Those were his exact words. Margaret read the message twice. She set the phone face down on the bed, finished packing the bag, and zipped it shut. The flight to Albany left at 7:15 the next morning. She booked it on her laptop at midnight using the household credit card, which still worked, which meant that whatever Arthur had done to their accounts had not yet reached everything. She set an alarm for 4:30 and laid down on top of the covers without undressing, and she did not sleep, but she rested, which was something. Outside the window, the October wind moved through the elm tree in the front yard, the one Arthur had planted the summer Chloe was born, and the branches knocked lightly against the glass in a rhythm that had been part of the sound of this house for 34 years. Margaret lay still and listened to it and thought about Lake George and thought about a brass key and a forged signature and a man who had organized his tools with such care that every absence had an outline painted around it. She thought about the stroller in the corner of the photograph. She did not sleep. The road into the Adirondacks does not announce itself. It simply begins somewhere north of Albany, where the interstate thins and the land rises and the trees press in from both sides until the sky overhead becomes a narrow corridor of gray October light. Margaret drove the rented sedan with both hands on the wheel and her eyes forward, and she did not think about where she was going in the way that people think about destinations. She thought about it the way a person thinks about a reckoning, something that has been coming for a long time and has simply now arrived at the door. She had been recalculating on the plane, not the estate figures, not the foreclosure timeline, but a different set of numbers entirely. The arithmetic of a marriage measured not in years, but in absences. She thought about every conference Arthur had attended in cities she could not now verify he had ever visited. She thought about the client emergencies that pulled him away on weekends, on holidays, on the evening of their 25th anniversary, when he had taken a call in the kitchen and told her quietly that something had come up and he was sorry. He really was sorry. And she had told him she understood because she had always told him she understood. She thought about the pattern Patricia had identified every time Arthur told the family they were struggling financially and money was moving somewhere else. She had lived inside that pattern for decades without seeing its shape the way you cannot see the shape of the room you are standing in until you step outside it. She had stepped outside it now. The GPS directed her off the main highway onto Blackwood Lane at 20 minutes past noon, and the road immediately changed character. The pavement narrowed to barely 2 lanes, and the trees on either side were old-growth pine enormous, and close, their roots heaving up through the shoulder in long, dark ridges. There were no streetlights. There were no mailboxes visible from the road. After 2 miles without any indication that anyone had ever built anything in this forest, Margaret understood something about this location that the deed of trust had not stated explicitly. This place had been selected not for its beauty, though the beauty was extraordinary, but for its invisibility. You did not find 188 Blackwood Lane by accident. You found it only if someone had already decided you were allowed to know it existed. The trees broke open all at once, the way curtains part, and there was the lake. Margaret pulled the car onto the shoulder behind a stand of weeping willows and turned off the engine and sat with both hands still on the wheel. The lake stretched out to the south under a low pewter sky, its surface dark and textured by a light wind, and on the slope above the shoreline sat the house from the photographs. Cedar shingles the color of driftwood. 8 large windows facing the water. A wraparound deck with an outdoor stone fireplace. A private dock extending into the lake where a small sailboat was moored, its lines slack in the still air. And behind the main house, separated by perhaps 40 yards of manicured lawn, a second structure smaller, a guest cottage, or a studio with its lights on in the middle of the afternoon. A white Range Rover sat in the circular driveway. Someone was home. Margaret did not move. She sat in the rented sedan behind the willows and watched the house the way she had learned to watch things over a lifetime of paying careful attention to what other people overlooked. 15 minutes passed. Then the front door of the main house opened and a woman came out onto the deck. She was perhaps 55 or 56, auburn-haired, in the way the woman in the photograph had been auburn-haired, though the years had added some silver at the temples and the style was shorter now. She wore a cashmere pullover and carried a mug in both hands, and she stood at the deck railing, looking out at the lake with the ease of someone who had stood in that exact spot 10,000 times. She was not beautiful in any remarkable way. She was something more specific than beautiful. She was comfortable. She occupied the space around her without effort or apology, and Margaret understood, watching her from behind the willows, that this was a woman who had never once believed she did not belong exactly where she was standing. Then the front door opened again, and a boy came out. He was small, dark-haired, moving with the quick economy of a child who had somewhere specific to be. He ran to the woman and pressed himself against her side the way young children do, briefly and completely, and the woman put her free arm around him and bent to say something close to his ear. He pulled back and looked up at her, nodded once, and then ran off across the lawn toward the smaller cottage with his arms out slightly as though he might at any moment decide to fly. Margaret watched him go. He was 9 years old at most, probably 9 exactly given the timing of the photograph and the stroller that had been in the corner of it. He disappeared through the door of the cottage, and the woman on the deck watched him go with a particular expression that Margaret recognized not as love exactly, but as the specific, settled tenderness of someone who has organized their entire life around another person's well-being and has long since made peace with having done so. Margaret had worn that expression herself for 40 years. She knew it from the inside. She sat behind the willows for 2 more hours. At 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the woman carried her empty mug inside, and 10 minutes after that, the Range Rover backed out of the driveway and headed down Blackwood Lane toward the main road. Margaret waited. She counted to 600 slowly, the way her mother had taught her to count when she was a child and needed to be certain of something before she acted. Then she got out of the car. The driveway was paved and silent under her shoes. She climbed the wide wooden steps to the front porch. The door was solid oak, custom made with a brass handle that had been polished to a high shine relatively recently. She took the key from her purse, the heavy brass key from Arthur's lockbox, and she slid it into the deadbolt. It turned without resistance. The door swung open. She stepped inside and stood still, letting the house establish itself around her. The interior was warm and smelled of cedarwood and something baking, the kind of ambient warmth that comes from a house that is well built and well tended and has been genuinely lived in for a long time. The living room ceiling, vaulted 2 stories overhead. A sectional sofa in deep charcoal faced the windows, and beyond them, the lake. The stone fireplace from the photograph was exactly as she had imagined it, but larger, its mantel holding a row of photographs in silver frames. Margaret walked to the mantel and looked at the photographs. Arthur and the woman at what appeared to be a vineyard, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Arthur and the boy in a canoe on the lake, the boy holding the paddle with intense and slightly wrong concentration. Arthur standing on the dock in summer, squinting into the sun, looking not like a man who was visiting, but like a man who had just finished mowing the lawn and had a few hours before dinner and intended to enjoy them. Margaret studied his face in each one. He looked younger than he had looked in Chicago for the last 15 years of his life. He looked as though the tension he had carried in his jaw and shoulders in their house, which she had attributed to professional stress, had simply been absent whenever he was here. She had never seen him look that way. Not once, not in 40 years. She moved through this kitchen without stopping, past the double oven and the marble countertops that Arthur had told her 3 separate times were beyond their budget, and she went upstairs. The home office was behind French doors at the end of the hall. She pushed them open and went directly to the desk, which was unlocked. She began pulling drawers. Utility bills addressed to Diane Harlow. Landscaping invoices addressed to Diane Harlow. Insurance documents, vehicle registrations, membership renewals, all of them in the name of Diane Harlow. But when she looked at the payment lines on each document, every account was debited from a corporate account belonging to Apex Holdings, LLC. In the bottom drawer beneath a ream of blank printer paper was a leather-bound ledger, its cover worn soft with handling. Margaret lifted it out and opened it on the desk. It was organized by year, beginning in 1999 and running through 2023. Each year contained columns for income transfers, disbursements, and what Arthur had labeled simply LG expenses, which she understood to mean Lake George. She did not read it column by column. She looked for the years she already knew and read outward from there. In 2001, the year Arthur told her the firm was failing, there was a single large entry in the disbursements column, the cash purchase of 188 Blackwood Lane. The source line read Apex Transfer Q3. In 2008, during the financial crisis that had prompted further household belt-tightening, there were 2 separate equity line entries for the Elmwood Drive property, both transferred immediately to Apex. She found her name on a line in 2018 Margaret A. Holloway Education Trust, established $180,000 funded from Apex Reserve. She read that line again. Arthur had created an educational trust in her name, funded with money he had taken from their family, to pay for the schooling of a child she had not known existed. He had used her name for the same reason he had used it for the house and the revocable trust and everything else, because her legal identity was clean and unencumbered, because she had no business dealings and no public profile and no record of any financial irregularity, because in 40 years of marriage, she had been so thoroughly kept outside the architecture of their shared finances that her name was the safest place he had to hide things. She was not a wife, she was a shield. Margaret set the ledger down and looked out the office window at the lake. The sky had gone darker in the last hour, the pewter deepening toward the flat gray of early evening, and the water below reflected it perfectly. She could see the boy moving along the shoreline below the cottage, throwing something into the water, maybe rocks, and watching the ripples expand and flatten. She thought about what it meant that Arthur had funded that child's education in her name. She thought about it for a long time standing at the window. Then she heard the Range Rover on the driveway gravel below. She did not move away from the window. She did not rush to straighten anything or compose herself or prepare a version of this moment that would be easier than what it was. She closed the ledger, placed it back in the bottom drawer exactly as she had found it, and walked to the door of the office. She went down the stairs at a normal pace and reached the bottom of the staircase just as the front door opened. Diane Harlow came in with 3 shopping bags and a coffee carrier. She was talking before she was fully through the door, the habit of someone who expected to be heard by a specific person in a specific room. She said something about the Wi-Fi router, something half amused and half exasperated. The tone of a woman who has been having the same mild argument with the same person for years and does not mind. Then she turned and saw Margaret standing at the base of the stairs. The shopping bags hit the floor. The coffee carrier tipped, and 2 of the cups tore open on the hardwood, spreading a pool of iced coffee and ice across the expensive rug. Neither woman moved to address it. Diane Harlow stared at Margaret the way people stare at things that cannot be there. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. Then something shifted in her face, a recognition that moved through her features like weather, and her complexion went from tan to ash in the time it takes to exhale. "You're Margaret," she said. It was not a question. "In the flesh," Margaret said. Diane's hand found the wall behind her. "How did you get in here?" "With a key." Margaret kept her voice at a conversational register. "The property is held in a trust that bears my name. The key was in my husband's workshop. It seemed reasonable to use it." Something shifted in Diane Harlow then, and it was not the collapse Margaret might have anticipated. The woman straightened. She let go of the wall. She was not going to make this easy, and Margaret found she respected that in a limited and complicated way. "Arthur bought this house," Diane said. "He built everything here. Whatever paperwork says your name, that was a legal arrangement he made for tax purposes. This house belongs to us," which is an interesting way to describe a property held in a trust you cannot legally access, Margaret said. "But I understand why you'd want to frame it that way." "You need to leave." Diane's voice had found its footing, now the specific authority of a woman defending her home. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but Arthur is going to—" She stopped. She looked at Margaret's face and stopped. Margaret let the silence do what it needed to do. "Arthur passed away 14 days ago," she said. "A cardiac event. He was shoveling snow in the driveway of our house in Chicago. We buried him on the 12th. Diane Harlow sat down. She did not find a chair first. She simply sat onto the edge of the rug at the base of the entryway among the spilled coffee and the scattered shopping bags, and she put both hands flat on the floor on either side of her, as though she needed to confirm that the floor was still there. The color had left her face entirely, and her eyes were moving in a rapid, unmoored way, looking for something to fix on. Margaret did not move to help her and did not move away. She waited. "That's not possible," Diane said very quietly. "He promised to file the divorce papers," Margaret said, not as an accusation. As a fact, she had already processed a detail she was simply accounting for. "He told you he was going back to Chicago to handle a business crisis and that when it was resolved, things would change." Diane looked up at her. The rawness in her face was not performance. "He said this time was different. He said he had been working toward it for years. He said by spring—" "He said that to me too," Margaret said. about different things over different years, but the structure was the same. That landed. Margaret watched it land. Diane was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, the territory of the conversation had changed. You went through his papers. I found them. Margaret moved to the kitchen island and set the manila envelope on the marble surface. I need you to look at something. Diane got herself up from the floor slowly with dignity, the way women who have survived difficult things get up from floors. She crossed to the island and looked down at the deed of trust Margaret had slid out of the envelope. She read it. Margaret watched her read it, watched the precise moment she found the name at the top of the entity. Margaret A. Holloway Revocable Trust. And then Apex Holdings listed below it as a subsidiary with ownership flowing upward. He told me Apex was mine, Diane said. Her voice had gone very flat. He said if anything ever happened, Apex would take care of me and William. He said the paperwork was arranged so that no one could touch it. No one can touch it, Margaret said. That part was accurate. I'm the only one who can touch it. Diane looked up from the papers. He used you. Yes. He used your name because yours was clean. That's my understanding. Diane pressed both palms flat on the marble and looked at the countertop for a moment. When she raised her head again, her expression had changed into something harder and more private. The boy, she said, William, he's 9. He doesn't know anything about any of this. I know, Margaret said. I saw him at the dock. Arthur set up an education trust for him. Diane's voice was steady now in the way that voices go steady when the person speaking them has decided not to fall apart because falling apart will not help anything. He said it was protected. He said William would always be taken care of regardless of what happened. It's in your name, Margaret said. Diane stared at her. What? The Education Trust. It was filed under Margaret A. Holloway. Margaret watched the understanding move through the other woman's face. He used my name for that too, so yes, at the moment, it falls under the same trust structure. She paused. I'm telling you this because I think you should know, not because I've decided what to do about it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the windows, the lake had gone dark, and the boy was no longer visible on the shoreline. Somewhere in the cottage across the lawn, a light had come on. Diane Harlow looked at Margaret Holloway across the marble island, across the spilled coffee, still soaking into the hallway rug across 22 years of a life built on architecture that someone else had engineered and neither of them had been permitted to fully see. What do you want? She asked. Right now. Margaret gathered the papers back into the envelope. I want to sit down. I've been awake for a long time. She walked to the living room and sat in the corner of the sectional, facing the windows, and she looked out at the dark lake and she listened to Diane Harlow's footsteps move slowly up the stairs. She sat there for 3 hours. She did not eat though she was hungry. She did not call anyone though she had several calls she needed to make. She watched the reflection of the room in the dark glass of the windows, the fireplace and the lamps and the photographs on the mantel, and she let herself feel without deflecting it the specific quality of the grief she was carrying. It was not the grief of losing Arthur. She had begun grieving Arthur some years ago, she understood now, in the gradual way you grieve something that has been disappearing slowly. What she felt tonight was something else. It was the grief of 40 years spent being faithful to a version of a man that had never been the complete truth. She had been married to a story Arthur told about himself, and she had tended that story carefully and believed in it and built her life around it, and now the story was over, and she was sitting in the living room of the life he had actually been living, and it was beautiful here, and that was perhaps the most painful thing of all. She heard footsteps on the stairs at 2 in the morning. Diane appeared in the entrance to the living room. She was not dressed for confrontation. She had changed into something plain, her hair loose, and she looked like what she was, a woman who could not sleep and had run out of alternatives to being honest. She sat at the other end of the sectional, far enough away to make no presumptions, and she tucked her feet beneath her and held her own hands in her lap. Neither of them spoke for a while. I met him in 1999, Diane said eventually. Her voice was quiet and without performance. He didn't tell me he would leave right away. He said it was complicated, that it would take time. I was 33 and I believed him because I wanted to believe him and because he was very good at making complicated sound temporary. She paused. I knew by 2009 that he was never going to leave. I had William by then. I had this house. I had built something. I told myself that was enough. Margaret listened without interrupting. He talked about you, Diane said. He said you were a good person. He said you were strong in ways that didn't need him. She looked at her own hands. He said you'd be all right. Margaret was quiet for a moment. He told me he traveled because clients needed him. He never told me that I didn't need him. He didn't give me the chance to disagree. She looked toward the dark windows. That was deliberate. A man who tells you that you're capable of managing without him can leave without feeling guilty. He had a very particular talent for arranging things so that he never had to feel guilty. Diane absorbed this in the way people absorb information that recontextualizes their own history. Margaret could see it happening in the other woman's face, a slow and uncomfortable reordering. There's something I need to show you, Diane said finally. She left the room and came back with a small object that she set on the cushion between them. A USB drive, black plastic, unremarkable. He gave me this in August, 2 months before he died. He said if something happened, I should open it. He said I would know when. She looked at Margaret. I opened it after I got the news from his firm. I didn't understand what it meant. I haven't known what to do with it. Margaret picked up the drive and held it. He knew, Diane said, about his heart. He'd been to a doctor in Vermont, Burlington. He came back different, and he wouldn't tell me what they'd said, and about a week later he gave me this. Margaret turned the drive over in her hand. She went to the desk in the corner of the living room where a laptop sat open and she plugged the drive in. One file appeared, a video. She opened it. Arthur sat in the office chair 2 floors above them at the desk where Margaret had read the ledger in front of the camera of whatever device had recorded this. He was wearing a shirt she recognized from the back of his closet in Chicago, a blue flannel she had washed hundreds of times. He looked tired in a specific way that she understood now as the fatigue of someone who has received information that cannot be undone. He spoke for 11 minutes. Margaret sat on the edge of the sofa and watched him speak. He said he had been diagnosed with a structural defect in his mitral valve and had been advised to undergo open heart surgery. He said he had decided not to. He said he had his reasons, which he did not elaborate. He said that he had arranged things through Apex and the trust structures so that Diane and William would be provided for, that the Lake George property was theirs in all practical terms, even if the legal architecture was more complicated, that Connor understood the plan and would provide support to ensure the transition went smoothly. He said he believed Margaret would manage because Margaret had always managed because that was who Margaret was. He did not look at the camera when he said her name. He looked at a point just to the left of it, the smallest possible evasion, barely visible. He said at the end, after a pause long enough that Margaret thought the recording might be finished, I was not a good man, but I tried to be a good man to the people who deserved it from me. The recording ended. Margaret sat completely still. She had known in the abstract way that truth announces itself before the mind is ready to hold it, what the recording would tell her. She had known from the moment Diane had placed the drive between them that it would contain something that reorganized the last 14 days of her understanding. But knowing in the abstract and arriving at the specific are different experiences, and she allowed herself the full weight of the specific. Arthur had known he was going to die. He had refused the surgery that might have prevented it, and he had spent his remaining months arranging outcomes for the people he loved, and he had done so with the precision of a man who understood financial architecture in considerable detail, and he had placed her name on all of it, not because he was thinking of her, but because her name was clean and her name was useful, and he had decided without consulting her that she would manage. He had never in 40 years asked her what she wanted. He had simply arranged what he thought she needed and assumed that was the same thing. Margaret looked at Diane. Diane was watching her with an expression that was neither triumphant nor pitying, but simply present the expression of someone who has just watched another person receive difficult information and understands what that feels like. Connor, Margaret said, he was here 3 weeks before Arthur died. Diane nodded slowly. They were in the office 4 hours. I don't know what they discussed, but when Connor left, Arthur seemed settled, like something had been resolved. Margaret stood up from the sofa. She took the USB drive from the laptop and held it in her closed hand. Outside the office window, the lake was beginning to lighten at the edges as the Adirondack dawn assembled itself in gradations of gray and pale gold. She had a drive that documented Arthur's knowledge of his own death. She had a ledger that mapped every dollar. She had a trust in her name that Apex Holdings sat inside, and she had a son who had sat beside her in a lawyer's office, knowing all of it and said nothing. And she had an appointment to be at First North Eastern Bank in Lake George when it opened at 9 o'clock. Patricia had found the attorney's name the night before, Dr. Sandra Oaks Real Estate and Trust Law, an office 2 blocks from the waterfront. Margaret had texted the address to herself and set an alarm for 7:30. The alarm had not gone off yet, but Margaret was already awake, and she was already thinking, and she had not been uncertain since somewhere around 2:40 in the morning, when she watched Arthur look away from the camera and knew exactly what she was going to do. She looked at Diane across the room. "Get some sleep," she said. "We'll talk more in the morning. There are things you need to know, and I'd rather tell you once clearly than have you find out from someone else." Diane looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of a certain kind of person, someone who, when they say they will handle something, actually handles it. "All right," Diane said quietly. Margaret sat back down in the corner of the sectional facing the windows and watched the lake come slowly back into visibility as the sky lightened. The sailboat on the dock moved faintly in the early wind. Somewhere in the cottage across the lawn, William Harlow was sleeping, and he did not know that his father was dead, and he did not know that the education fund bearing a stranger's name was the thing that stood between him and an uncertain future. And he did not know that the stranger was sitting 40 yards away in the dark, deciding what to do about it. Margaret Holloway had been awake for most of 2 days. She had a drive in her hand and a ledger in a desk upstairs and an appointment in 4 hours with a lawyer who did not yet know the full scope of what she was bringing through the door. She had also somewhere between the moment she broke the padlock in the basement and this moment on the sofa with the lake going gold outside stopped being the woman who managed things by staying quiet. She was not certain yet what she had become instead, but she knew she had approximately 4 hours to figure it out, and she had always worked well under pressure, and the morning was coming in fast off the water, and there was a great deal left to do. She called Patricia at 6:47 in the morning, standing on the wraparound deck in the cold watching the lake hold its first light the way still water holds everything, without preference, without judgment. Patricia answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake already, which meant she had been waiting. "Talk to me," Patricia said. Margaret told her about the video. She told her about Arthur's voice, the blue flannel shirt, the 11 minutes the moment he looked away from the camera. She told her about Connor being at the house 3 weeks before Arthur died, the hours in the office, the settled expression on Arthur's face afterward. She told her about the education trust in her name, the $180,000 designated for a child she had never met, funded from money taken from a life she had believed was shared. Patricia listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the thing Margaret valued most about her. When Margaret finished, Patricia said, "Connor filed a request 2 days ago. A Dallas attorney sent paperwork to First Northeastern Bank requesting emergency access to the Apex Holdings accounts. The request is sitting in their legal queue right now unprocessed." Margaret turned to look through the glass at the dark interior of the house. "How do you know that?" "Because I called the bank yesterday and asked to speak to someone in the trust and estates department and explained that I was consulting on behalf of the account holder." A brief pause. "I may have implied I was your attorney." "Are you?" "I'm retired, but I still know how to read a trust document, and I know what Sandra Oaks can do with one. She's expecting you at 8:30. Go earlier if you can." Margaret looked at her watch. "That gives me 45 minutes. Then stop standing on the deck and start driving." Margaret went inside. Diane's bedroom door was still closed. She wrote a short note on a piece of paper she found in the kitchen drawer and left it on the island. "I will be back this afternoon. Do not contact anyone until I return." She signed it with her first name only. Then she picked up her purse, made sure the USB drive and the envelope of documents were inside it, and left the house, quietly locking the deadbolt behind her. The drive into town took 12 minutes. The main street of Lake George in late October had the specific emptiness of a resort community after its season has ended. The storefronts half-shuttered, the sidewalks clean and wide, and unpeopled, the whole place existing in a kind of patient suspension, waiting for June to return. Sandra Oaks had an office above a marine supply store on the waterfront block, accessible by a wooden staircase on the outside of the building. Margaret climbed it at 8:15 and knocked. Sandra Oaks opened the door herself. She was 50 or 50, one compact and direct with short dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades not wasting anything. She looked at Margaret the way doctors look at patients when they have already reviewed the file, assessing but not unkind. "Come in," she said. "Patricia told me the broad strokes. I need the details." Margaret sat down across from her desk and laid everything out. The deed of trust, the forged signatures, the ledger, the Apex subsidiary structure, the USB drive, which she described but did not play. Sandra Oaks read the documents without commentary, moving through each page with the focused efficiency of someone who has spent a career translating complicated legal architecture into plain consequences. She made 3 handwritten notes on a yellow pad. Then she set the papers down and folded her hands. "The forgery is actually what makes your position cleanest," Sandra said. "A forged grantor signature on a revocable trust would normally invalidate the instrument. But in this case, Arthur wasn't acting as grantor in bad faith against you. He was acting as your agent using your identity to create a structure he controlled. The courts have consistently held in situations like this that the named grantor, which is you, retains full legal authority over the trust, and that any proxy action taken without explicit authorization is void upon the proxy's death." Margaret followed this without difficulty. She had read enough in the past 2 weeks to understand the framework. "What it means practically," Sandra continued, "is that the moment Arthur died, every action he had taken on behalf of the trust as an unauthorized agent became legally his estate's liability, not yours. And since the estate is insolvent, those liabilities go nowhere. What remains is the trust itself and its assets fully under your authority as the sole living grantor and trustee." She paused. "Apex Holdings, as a wholly owned subsidiary of the trust, falls under the same authority. Any request for account access from a third party, including your son's attorneys in Dallas, has no legal standing." "How quickly can we get to the bank?" Margaret asked. Sandra Oaks picked up her coat from the back of her chair. "I drove past it on my way in this morning. It opens at 9. They arrived at First Northeastern Bank at 8:58 and waited on the sidewalk until the branch manager unlocked the front door. His name was Thomas Merritt, a man in his early 60s with the careful manner of someone who manages other people's money and has learned to be neutral about all of it. He recognized Sandra Oaks with a nod that suggested some prior professional acquaintance, and he looked at Margaret with the politely guarded attention of a man who does not yet know what kind of morning this is going to be. "I'm Margaret Holloway," she said. "I'm here to assume direct control of the accounts held by the Margaret A. Holloway Revocable Trust and its subsidiary Apex Holdings, LLC. My husband, Arthur Holloway, was the trust's unauthorized agent. He died 14 days ago." She set the death certificate and the trust documents on the counter between them. "I understand there is a pending request for account access from a third party. I need that request denied and all secondary access suspended immediately." Merritt looked at the documents. He looked at Sandra. He said he would need to contact the bank's legal department before taking any action on existing access requests, which Margaret had expected, and Sandra produced her business card and indicated she was available to speak with legal counsel directly, which Merritt had perhaps not expected. The conversation that followed lasted 52 minutes. Margaret sat in one of the chairs along the wall and did not check her phone and did not look at her watch. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the ambient sounds of the bank opening around her, a teller counting a drawer, a phone ringing somewhere in the back, the particular low hum of an institution going about its business, and she thought about nothing specific. She had learned somewhere in the last 2 weeks that there were moments that required action and moments that required stillness, and she had gotten better at knowing which was which. Merritt came back at 10:12 with a different expression. The legal department has reviewed the trust instrument in the supporting documentation, he said. He had the tone of someone who has just received instructions that changed the nature of the situation he thought he was managing. You have full authority over all accounts. I've suspended secondary access as requested. He set a printed statement on the table in front of her. Your liquid holdings as of this morning. Margaret read the statement. The primary checking account held $1.4 million. The managed investment portfolio held $3.2 million. The education trust for William Arthur Harlow held $180,000 listed separately, but flagged as a trust subsidiary. She looked at the total at the bottom of the page and allowed herself briefly and without expression to register the full scope of what Arthur had built and hidden and arranged and believed she would never find. This account, she said, indicating the education trust line, freeze it. Don't close it. Just freeze all activity until further notice. Merritt made a note, of course. Margaret folded the statement and placed it in her purse. She stood and put on her coat. She was buttoning it when Merritt cleared his throat with the specific diffidence of someone who has something to say and isn't certain whether to say it. Mrs. Walsh, he said, your husband came into this branch every month for 15 years. He was very consistent. He paused. He always brought flowers, left them on the table while we worked. Yellow ones, the small kind. Margaret's hand stopped on the last button. Do you know what kind they were? She asked. My wife grows them, Merritt said. I believe they're called button chrysanthemums. The wild variety, gold-colored. Margaret finished buttoning her coat. Thank you, Mr. Merritt, she said, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the bank, and she walked out through the glass door into the cold October air. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Sandra was beside her saying something about next steps and timelines, and Margaret heard her but did not immediately respond because she was thinking about the garden at Elmwood Drive, the strip of soil along the front walk where she grew button chrysanthemums every autumn from bulbs she divided and replanted each spring. She had grown them for 30 years. Arthur had cut them and brought them inside, which she had always taken as a small domestic gesture, the kind of thing a husband does. She had never tracked where they went after he took them from the garden. She had never thought to ask. He had brought her flowers to the bank where he laundered the money he stole from her. Month after month for 15 years. Whether that was guilt or ritual or something else entirely, she would never know. She was not certain it mattered. What mattered was that she knew it now, and knowing it closed something the way the last line of a very long account closes a ledger. She turned to Sandra. What do I need to do today specifically to ensure nothing moves before I get proper counsel in Chicago? Sandra outlined 3 things. Margaret committed them to memory, thanked her, and said she would be in touch before end of week. Then she went back to her car. She was 20 minutes from the house when her phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize with a 214 area code. Dallas, she let it ring. 30 seconds later, a text arrived from Connor. Mom, I'm in Albany. I drove up last night. I need to talk to you, please. She read it once and set the phone on the passenger seat. When she pulled into the driveway at 188 Blackwood Lane, Diane's Range Rover was there, but a second car was not. She went inside. Diane was in the kitchen dressed with coffee made, and she looked as though she had not slept, but had arrived at some resolution in the hours since Margaret left that made the sleeplessness worth it. I've been thinking, Diane said, about what you said last night, about him using both of us. She held her mug in both hands. I spent 22 years telling myself it was different for me, that I was different from the arrangement in Chicago. That's a very comfortable story to tell yourself when you live in a house like this. She looked toward the windows. The video changes that. He was arranging outcomes. For all of us. None of us were deciding anything. No, Margaret agreed. We weren't. What happens to me? The question was direct and without self-pity. Practically. What happens to William and me? Margaret sat down across from her. I don't know yet. I need to work through the full legal picture with counsel in Chicago. But I want to tell you something clearly, So you're not waiting on an uncertainty for longer than necessary. She looked at Diane steadily. The education trust for William. I've frozen it, not closed it. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. But I want you to know that your son's situation is not something I'm treating as collateral damage. Diane looked at her across the table for a long moment. Why? Because he's 9, Margaret said, and because I can. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, a car turned onto the driveway, and Margaret recognized from the sound of it that it was not Diane's Range Rover. She heard the engine cut and a car door close and then footsteps on the porch stairs and then the knock. She went to the door and opened it. Connor was standing on the porch in a jacket he had clearly been wearing since the previous day, with the look of a man who had driven through the night on an impulse and arrived at the destination before he had fully worked out what to say. He was 38 years old, and he looked in this moment considerably younger. He looked like a boy who had made a decision he understood was wrong and had spent a great deal of time since then learning to live inside it. "Mom," he said. Margaret stepped forward and let him in. She did not offer him coffee. She stood in the middle of the living room and waited. Connor came inside and saw Diane at the kitchen table and stopped. He had not expected that. He regrouped quickly the way engineers regroup when load calculations produce unexpected results, and he turned back to his mother. "I need to explain," he said. "All right," Margaret said, "explain." He told her that Arthur had come to Dallas 8 months ago before the Burlington diagnosis. Though Connor had not known about Burlington at the time, Arthur had told him the broad outline, the Lake George property, the trust structure, Diane and William the apex arrangement. He had told Connor that when the time came, Connor's role would be to ensure the transition of account access was smooth, to act as a liaison between the legal structures Arthur had built and the reality of what came after. Arthur had told him it was a matter of protecting the family, the whole family, and that Margaret would be taken care of, and that the most important thing was that William's future was secured. "He told you your mother would lose her home," Diane said from the kitchen table. Her voice was flat and factual. Connor looked at her. He said she would be protected through other means. He said the trust structure would ensure— "Connor," Margaret's voice was quiet and final, "you sat in Richard Calloway's office. You watched that man tell me I had $5,000 and 30 days before the bank took my house. You were sitting 2 feet from me." She let that settle. "You didn't say anything." Connor opened his mouth and closed it. The rehearsed version of this conversation, whatever it had been, was gone. What was left was the unrehearsed version, which was simply a son who had chosen his father's plan over his mother's well-being and had been living in the gap between those two things ever since. "He said you were strong," Connor said, and even as he said it, he seemed to understand how it sounded. "He said that to everyone," Margaret replied. "It was a very efficient excuse. It meant he never had to ask." "I'm sorry." The words came out without any of the structure around them that words need to sound sufficient. They were just the words, unadorned, offered into a room that had already heard too many insufficient things. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. She thought about the morning after Arthur died, Connor in the hallway asking about the workshop before she had changed her clothes. She thought about the power of attorney document he had brought to Elmwood Drive. She thought about the years of this family's life that had been shaped without any of them fully understanding it by the decisions of one man who had believed he was the only one capable of making them. "I'm not going to involve attorneys in what you did," she said. "Not because I think it was acceptable, but because your sister has already lost her father and I won't take her brother from her as well." She paused. "But you need to understand something. The request your Dallas attorneys filed with the bank this morning was denied. Whatever Arthur promised you in terms of access to Apex, that is finished. You will receive nothing from this estate, not because I'm punishing you, but because you assisted in concealing fraud and you are not entitled to profit from that." Connor sat down in the nearest chair. Not because he was invited to, but because his legs had made the decision. "Your father told you that I would manage," Margaret said. "He told Diane the same thing about himself. He told William through the education trust that he would always be taken care of. He had a version of the future for everyone, and he built it in secret, and he assumed no one would ever need to look at the seams." She picked up her purse from the chair where she'd left it. The seams are visible now. I'm going to spend the next several months doing what I always did, which is making the practical reality of this family function, except this time I will be doing it with full information and legal authority, which is an improvement. She looked at Connor steadily. Go home. Call your sister. Tell her the truth, all of it, before she hears it from me. That's the thing you can do right now that would actually help. Connor sat in the chair and looked at his hands. He looked like his father in the facial structure, but he had none of his father's facility for forward motion under pressure. He simply sat. Margaret left him there. She walked through the kitchen past Diane, who was watching with the expression of a woman absorbing a lesson she had not expected to receive today, and she went out the back door and down the slope to the dock. The sailboat moved in the light chop, and the lines tapped against the mast in a small, steady rhythm. The lake was enormous and gray and indifferent and very beautiful. She stood at the end of the dock for a long time. She was not certain what she felt. She had been not certain for several days, and she had stopped expecting certainty to arrive on a schedule. What she knew was this: she was 68 years old. She was standing on a dock that belonged to her on a lake she had not known existed 3 weeks ago. She had $4.6 million in accounts that bore her name and her authority, and she had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since Arthur died. And the sky above the Adirondacks was the precise color of grief that has moved past its acute phase into something older and more permanent, not healed but incorporated, carried. She stayed on the dock until she heard a car start in the driveway above the house. Connor leaving. She waited until the sound was gone, then went back inside. Diane was standing at the kitchen window watching the road. He looked like him, she said quietly, the way he sat in that chair. Yes, Margaret said, he does. 2 days later, Diane took William and drove north toward Vermont. She did not ask for anything before she went. She came to Margaret in the living room on the morning of the second day and stood in the doorway and said, I don't know if there's a version of this where I could have done differently. I've been trying to decide that for 2 days, and I don't have an answer yet. She paused. But I think you're the most clear-headed person I've ever watched handle something like this. I don't mean that as a compliment exactly. I mean it as an observation. Margaret looked at her. Where will you go? I have a sister in Burlington. We haven't spoken in 5 years. She'll let us stay. Good, Margaret said. And then because it was true, and because the boy deserves someone to say it, William seems like a good kid. Diane's expression shifted in a way that was too complicated to name. He is, she said. He's the best thing. She picked up the bag she'd set by the door. I hope the lawyers don't take too long. I hope you can start living your own life soon. I already am, Margaret said. She watched the Range Rover go down the driveway and disappear into the pines, and then she was alone in the house for the first time, and she stood in the middle of the living room and listened to the silence of it, which was not uncomfortable. It was simply quiet. After 11 days in Chicago of a silence that felt like accusation, this silence felt like something she was permitted. The following weeks were dense with legal process. Margaret flew back to Chicago, retained an estate attorney of her own, and began the methodical work of untangling Arthur's architecture from the inside. A forensic accountant worked through the Apex ledger and identified the full scope of the transfers over 24 years. The total was considerably more than the bank statement had shown, because Arthur had been systematic and patient in a way that required systematic and patient unraveling. The corporate liabilities he had accrued through Apex were resolved quietly and without publicity one by one over the course of several months. She wired $250,000 to Richard Calloway's escrow account on the second Wednesday of November and instructed him to halt the foreclosure proceedings on Elmwood Drive. Calloway called her personally to confirm receipt. His voice had changed in the weeks since the reading of the will. The rehearsed warmth stripped back to reveal the more honest tone underneath which was professional deference. She preferred it. She transferred the deed to 412 Elmwood Drive into Chloe's name on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, sitting at the oak kitchen table where she had spent so many mornings the same table where she had spread bank statements at 2 in the morning 6 weeks earlier. She signed the transfer documents with her own signature, the real one, the one that slanted the way it had always slanted. She did not feel sentimental about the house in the way she had expected to. She felt something cleaner than sentiment. She felt right. Chloe had driven down from her apartment to be there for the signing, and afterward, they sat at the table with tea and did not talk about Arthur for a while, which was its own kind of relief. Chloe had called Connor after Margaret asked her to, and the conversation between them had been long and difficult and had not resolved anything permanently, but had opened a door that might over considerable time lead to something worth walking through. Margaret had not spoken to Connor since the morning on the deck. She was not ready yet, and she had decided that not being ready yet was an acceptable thing to be. She called Patricia from the car on the way back to the airport. "It's done," she said. "All of it? Enough of it for today." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking out the window at the Chicago streets. She had known for 40 years the specific gray of the November sky over the lake, the city she had lived inside someone else's version of for longer than she wanted to count. "I feel like myself," she said. "I'm not sure I know exactly who that is yet, but it's a start." In the first week of December, she instructed Sandra Oakes to transfer the William R. Arthur Harlow Education Trust out of the Apex subsidiary structure and into a fully independent account in the boy's name, administered by a neutral fiduciary with no connection to the Walsh estate. She did not notify Diane directly. She asked Sandra to send a formal legal notice confirming the fund was secured and independently administered, no conditions, no contact required. Sandra asked if she was certain. Margaret said she was. She was not certain it was the right thing. She was certain it was the thing she could do and still recognize herself afterward, and that was the only test she had left that meant anything. She flew back to Lake George in the second week of December when the town was quiet in the particular way of places that go genuinely quiet in winter, rather than simply less busy. The house on Blackwood Lane was exactly as she had left it. She opened the windows to let the cold air through, carried Diane's remaining personal items to the garage for donation, and began the process of making the house into something that had not been built on the careful concealment of someone else's life. She hired contractors to repaint the interior a different color in every room. She had the master bedroom furniture removed and replaced. She kept the stone fireplace in the vaulted ceiling and the windows facing the lake, because those were the bones of the place, and she had nothing against the bones. She ordered a new sofa in a color she chose herself, a deep blue-green, that reminded her of the lake in summer, and she arranged it facing the water the way the old one had been arranged, but slightly different, slightly her own. She found a nursery in Glens Falls that sold perennial bulbs for autumn planting, and she bought 3 dozen button chrysanthemums in gold, the wild variety, and she planted them herself along the southern edge of the deck where they would get the afternoon light. She was on her knees in the cold dirt, pressing bulbs into the prepared soil, when she understood something that she had been approaching for weeks without quite arriving at. She was not planting these flowers to reclaim something Arthur had taken. She was planting them because she liked them, because she had always liked them, because they were hers in a way that had nothing to do with him at all. The connection to Arthur was the thing that was going to fade. The flowers would remain. Patricia came for Thanksgiving, driving up from Evanston in a car loaded with enough food for people who intended to take the holiday seriously. They ate at the table in the kitchen with the new chairs Margaret had picked out, and they drank wine Margaret had chosen from a winery she had found by driving along the lake road one afternoon, until she saw a sign that looked interesting, and they talked about everything except Arthur for 3 hours, and then they talked about Arthur for 1 hour, and then they talked about everything else again. "Do you miss him?" Patricia asked somewhere in the second hour of wine. Margaret thought about it honestly. "I miss the version of him I believed in," she said. "I don't know if that's the same as missing him." "No," Patricia said. "It isn't, but it's allowed." The morning after Thanksgiving, Margaret woke before dawn and made coffee and carried it to the desk in the office on the second floor, the same desk where she had read the ledger, and she opened her laptop. She had been in correspondence for 3 weeks with a professor in Northwestern's English department who ran a program for returning scholars, people who had interrupted advanced degrees for reasons the department now understood were often not entirely voluntary. The program offered a formal affiliation access to library resources and an annual colloquium at which affiliated scholars could present work in progress. She had told no one about this except Patricia. She opened the email thread and read back through it from the beginning. Then she opened a new document and looked at the blank page for a moment, the particular blankness of a page that has been waiting long enough to have become patient rather than empty. She began to write. Not the dissertation, not yet. Something smaller, a few pages on a single passage from Mrs. Dalloway that she had been thinking about since 1981 and had never had the time or the permission or the distance to address properly. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. The lake outside went from black to dark gray to the particular translucent silver of early morning on still water. The words came in the way that words come when the mind has been holding them at a distance for longer than it should have quickly, and with a clarity that surprised her not because she had forgotten how to do this, but because she had not known until this morning that she still could. She stopped when she heard Patricia moving in the kitchen below. She saved the document, closed the laptop, and looked at her hands on the desk for a moment. The same hands that had broken a padlock 6 weeks ago. The same hands that had signed papers and planted bulbs and made the particular gestures of a life that was from this morning forward entirely her own to arrange. She reached into the drawer of the desk and took out the brass key. She had been carrying it in her purse since Chicago, and she had taken to keeping it in the drawer here in this desk in this room, where it had spent 22 years hidden in someone else's filing system. She turned it over in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the geometric pattern on the bow, worn smooth in the places where Arthur's thumb had pressed it most often. She stood up, went down the hall to the guest room where Chloe would sleep when she came at Christmas, and she put the key in the small ceramic dish on the nightstand. It would be there when Chloe arrived. She would explain then, or she would not explain, and Chloe would keep it, or she would not, and either way, the key would have traveled from Arthur's secret to Margaret's reckoning to her daughter's hands, which was a journey long enough that it had earned its end. She went downstairs. Patricia was standing at the kitchen counter with her own coffee, looking out at the lake, and she turned when Margaret came in and said nothing, which was the right thing. Margaret poured her coffee and stood beside her friend at the window, and outside the light was coming up fast off the water now, the way it does in winter when the sun stays low and everything is clear and cold and very precise, and the lake was going from silver to something that was not quite any color she had a name for, and the chrysanthemum bed was a dark strip of turned earth along the south edge of the deck, waiting as bulbs wait in the particular patient way of things that know they will come back.